Alright, today's video is a bit of a different topic rather than our usual content. Earlier this year, I made a video talking about the graphic card that I've been using for the past 3 years, which is an RTX 3070 Ti, and answer the question whether 8 gigs of VRAM is enough for AAA gaming in 2024. A lot of you guys seems to interest in that topic, and I received tons of comments from you guys. So this is going to be kind of a follow-up video talking about bunch of other games and how the card is holding up against some of the most demanding titles in 2024. And in our previous video, we discussed about 10 different games, including popular games like Cyberpunk 2077, Alan Wake 2, and bunch of other popular demanding titles. And if you want to see the benchmark, I will link the video down in the description. But today we're going to take a look at on 10 different games, including some of the most popular games as well as some incredibly demanding titles that very recently released. And everything is running on the most popular resolution nowadays, which is this 2560 by 1440. Let's see how much of a sacrifice we have to make in order to run some of these games with 8 gigs of VRAM, starting with a very popular title, Red Dead Redemption 2. It's a very well optimized nowadays, doesn't really require a lot of VRAM. I tried the game out on ultra setting at first, but everything looks so blurry. Then I did a bunch of research and found out the most optimized setting for PC, which is the console equivalent settings from Digital Foundry. It gives you a very nice balance between performance and fidelity. On 1440p optimized settings without using any upscaling methods, the game ran perfectly around 85 to 100 FPS most of the time. I also did run the in-game benchmark, which average gives you about 96 FPS, which is really great. And also in a less demanding area, the game even pushed beyond 100 FPS, close to like 110, and there is no lags, stutters or FPS drops or anything like that. 8GB VRAM is simply not an issue when you're playing Red Dead Redemption 2 with these optimized settings, or even you can play the game with 4K resolution on DLSS set to performance, and you will get around 60 FPS, pretty smooth experience overall. Alright, next up we got the Horizon Forbidden West Complete Edition, very recently released, a pretty demanding title, especially when it comes to VRAM. I tried the game out on 1440p max settings, DLSS set to quality, and it's very demanding on this graphic card, especially on this opening area. Tend to have a lot of frame drops, and overall frame rate is hovering around 40 to 60 FPS. Then I simply dropped the settings to high and some of these settings to medium, like shadow quality and level of detail, and ultimately resulting a very playable frame rate around 70 to 90 FPS. But couple of times it's dropped down below 60, especially in these opening scenes, which is quite demanding when it comes to textures, vegetation, and overall detail. Overall, you can play the game on 1440p DLSS set to quality on these high to medium settings and ultimately get a very playable experience. Alright, next up we got a very popular racing title, and that is a Need for Speed Unbound. Definitely not the most demanding game out there, and overall performed really smoothly on a 3070 Ti. I tried the game out on ultra settings on DLSS set to quality on 1440p. The game ran perfectly fine, the average frame rate around 90 to 110 FPS depending on the region, especially in a more demanding area like on a city area, you will get around 90-95 FPS, and on a less demanding area you will push beyond 100, close to like 110-115 FPS. Overall it performs really well, there is no FPS drops, stutters or anything like that, and also the VRAM usage is very close to 8 gigs, but it doesn't really impact the performance, which is really great. Dead Island 2 is another game that runs really well with the 3070 Ti, on everything set into max on Epic preset on 1440p resolution without using any upscaling method. The game ran perfectly fine around 90 to 110 FPS. At the start of the game take you about a minute to compile all the shaders, but if you skip that part, the game is going to be a stuttery mess, so do not skip that, otherwise the game runs perfectly fine. Unfortunately, it does not support Nvidia DLSS, it's only support AMD FSR2. If you need more frame rate, you can definitely enable it, otherwise the game runs really well, extremely sharp on native 1440p, and also perform with a very acceptable frame rate. And one of my favorite single player games that I played a while back, which is the Ghost of Tsushima, and I'm happy to say the game is finally available on PC and also very well optimized at launch. First I tried to run the game on very high preset on 1440p DLSS set to quality. It runs fine for the most part, but sometimes it tends to frame drop here and there, and also the VRAM usage is pretty close to 8 gigs. Then I simply change the texture quality to high and keep everything else on very high settings, and the game runs really well, around 70 to 90 FPS on the open world. And also if you're running the game with the Nvidia 30 series graphic card, you got the option to enable the AMD FSR3 frame generation, which basically double your frame rate and give you a very smooth experience, especially if you have a high refresh rate monitor. Otherwise, for a single player game like this, 70 to 90 FPS is very much acceptable. Next up we got Ready or Not, one of the most impressive looking and more demanding first person shooters out there right now, but surprisingly it runs really well on a 3070 Ti with 8 gigs of VRAM. I played the game on 1440p epic settings on DLSS set to quality, and most of the time I get around around 100 plus FPS, and sometimes it drop it down to like 90s. So depending on the map that you play, I would say you will get around 90 to 120 FPS. And also we are very close to max out the VRAM capacity, but there was no any massive hiccups, FPS drops or lags during my benchmark. It does seem like the game is very well optimized nowadays, and visually the game looks absolutely impressive with these max settings and overall performs really well. Next up we got the most recent Dying Light 2 Reloaded Edition, another very well optimized game nowadays and perform extremely well with the 3070 Ti, honestly a lot better than I expected. I was able to play the game on the highest possible settings with ray tracing enabled on 1440p DLSS set to quality. I was able to get a frame rate around 60 to 75 FPS, and on a less demanding open world area you can push the frame rate even beyond that. And also the game does not require tons of VRAM. The VRAM usage is hovering around 6.5 to 7 gigs even with these highest possible settings with the ray tracing. And during my benchmark time the frame rate does not dip below 60 at any point of time. So if you're playing a single player game like this, you can cap the frame rate to 60 on 1440p max setting and get a very playable frame rate. Next up I test out a brand new game called Still Wakes the Deep, another very recently released pretty demanding title and visually another very impressive looking game. I tried to run the game on Epic setting DLSS set to quality on 1440p. I was only able to get around 50 to 60 FPS most of the time. Simply the game was way too demanding for a graphic card like this to run on a max settings. Then I tried the game everything set to high on 1440p DLSS set to quality. I was able to get around 65 to 75 FPS, very acceptable performance overall. But my favorite way to play this game right now is by enabling the AMD FSR 3 frame generation on 1440p high setting AMD FSR set to quality, and with the frame generation on I was able to basically double my frame rate. Now I get around 115 to 130 FPS, which is really awesome, and visually it looks really good. It doesn't seem like a massive downgrade. Overall a very smooth experience. Next up we got the popular Witcher 3 Wild Hunt Complete Edition with the next gen visual overhaul, another game that ran extremely well on a card like this on 1440p Ultra Plus settings without using any upscaling method, and I don't think the game support any upscaling methods. On native 1440p I was able to get around 70 to 90 FPS depending on the area of the open world, and still the game looks absolutely stunning, especially with this brand new next generation upgrade. And the game is very well optimized even for very low end PCs nowadays, and the VRAM usage is only hovering around 4.5 gigs. Overall the games run extremely smoothly. And finally we got one of the most demanding PC games out there right now, and that is the Hellblade 2 Senua's Saga. And there is no surprise the 3070 Ti is actually struggling to run this game on max settings 1440p. First of all I tried the game on 1440p DLSS set to quality on high settings, which is the highest possible settings that you can enable in the game, and I was only able to get around 45 to 55 FPS. It's a very cinematic, slow paced third person game. If you want to play the game like this you can definitely enjoy the game without any issues, but we at least try to get 60 FPS on the game, so you might have to drop some of these settings to medium. And I tried the medium preset on 1440p DLSS set to quality. I was easily able to get around 60 to 75 FPS. Even with this medium setting, it's an absolute visual masterpiece. Overall it performs a lot better than I expected. On highest preset the VRAM usage is very much close to 8 gigs, but on medium settings it only hovering around 6.5 to 7 gigs, which overall give you a very smooth performance with very acceptable frame rate. So finally I gotta say 8 gigs of VRAM for a card like a 3070 Ti is simply not acceptable in 2024. Imagine this card comes out with 12 gigs of VRAM. It's going to perform extremely well with some of these games, and with the techniques like Nvidia DLSS and AMD FSR, you'll be able to push some of these games to 4K with max settings and get a very acceptable frame rate. So if you have a graphic card like this, like a 3070 Ti, 3070 or anything with 8 gigs of VRAM, you can still enjoy all of these games with 1440p, but you might have to turn down some of these settings to like medium or sometimes low, and enabling techniques like AMD FSR and maybe frame generation to get an acceptable frame rate. And it all depends on what games are you actually playing. If you're someone who playing more competitive games like Valorant, CSGO or Call of Duty, 8 gigs of VRAM is simply not an issue with 1440p unless if you're trying to run the games on 4K. But if you're someone who play a lot of single player demanding games, and if you're in the market for a brand new graphic card, I would suggest you to go for at least 12 gigs of VRAM, which is kind of the bare minimum right now for most of these AAA games, especially if you are playing on 1440p. But if you're someone who coming from an old PC and looking for an upgrade, so right now if you have a card like a 1060, 2060, 3070 Ti with 8 gigs of VRAM, it's going to be a very nice upgrade for your current setup, and you will be able to easily find a used card between $250 to $300. Well, that's pretty much it guys. I hope this video helpful to you in some way. If it does, don't forget to go ahead and drop a like, subscribe and stay tuned. I will catch you guys soon in the next one. Stay safe.